Imagine walking into a new school, expecting just another ordinary day, only to be humiliated by a teacher in front of the entire class. But what happens when the so-called helpless new kid turns out to be a genius? And not just any genius, one who's about to flip the entire school's hierarchy on its head. You won't believe how this story unfolds. Stay till the end to see how one girl takes on a ruthless teacher, a powerful queen bee, and an entire school system on her terms. Drop a comment below. Have you ever been underestimated? How did you prove them wrong? Like and subscribe for more thrilling stories that keep you on the edge of your seat. The small town of Willow Creek had always been the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Nestled between rolling hills and thick forests, its only high school, Willow Creek High, was a blend of tradition and unspoken rules. The students knew their place in the social hierarchy. Jocks ruled the fields, cheerleaders owned the halls, and the academically gifted found their refuge in the library, away from the prying eyes of those who considered intelligence a burden rather than a gift. But things changed the day Alara Quinn walked through the doors. She was new, an outsider, and if there was one thing Willow Creek High despised, it was change. Alara had moved to town with her grandmother, a woman as mysterious as the swirling fog that often lingered over the town's hills. No one knew much about them, except that they came from somewhere far, far away. Her first day at school was exactly what one would expect for a new student. Whispers in the hallways, sideways glances, and the occasional deliberate nudge in the cafeteria line. But none of it seemed to faze her. She was quiet, observant, and carried herself with a certain air of detachment, as if the petty dramas of high school were beneath her notice. Dressed in simple jeans and an oversized sweater, her jet-black hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders, framing sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. And then came Mrs. Calloway. The senior math teacher had been at Willow Creek High for over 20 years, and in that time she had developed a reputation for being unforgiving. She had an uncanny ability to sniff out weakness and never hesitated to make an example of students who she deemed unworthy of her subject. She had noticed Alara from the moment she stepped into the classroom. A new student, one who hadn't been broken in yet. Mrs. Calloway lived for moments like this. "Ah, Miss Quinn," she called out, her sharp voice slicing through the room. "Since you're new here, why don't you come up to the board?" Alara glanced up from her desk, her expression unreadable. A few students smirked, already sensing what was coming. "This," Mrs. Calloway said, writing a sprawling equation on the board, "is a problem I doubt any of my students could solve. But since you're new, let's see what you can do." There was a cruel glint in her eye, a smirk tugging at the corners of her lips. She expected hesitation. She expected stumbling. She expected Alara to shrink under the weight of the attention. What she did not expect was for Alara to stand up, push her chair back with an air of quiet confidence, and stroll toward the board without a single flicker of doubt. The room was silent. Alara picked up the chalk, eyed the problem for a brief moment, and then, without hesitation, began writing. Mrs. Calloway's smirk faltered. A few students exchanged glances, because what was happening on that board was nothing short of extraordinary. As the chalk moved across the board, the only sound in the room was the faint scratching of Alara's swift calculations. The numbers and symbols poured out of her like water from a spring, fluid, effortless, and precise. The equation Mrs. Calloway had chosen was deliberately complex, a problem that would stump even the brightest students in the class. A problem meant to humble Alara, but instead it was as if she saw through it, unraveling its layers with an ease that sent a shiver through the room. Mrs. Calloway's arms were folded, her initial smirk frozen as she watched, eyes narrowing slightly. "This isn't possible." A few students leaned forward in their seats. Others exchanged wide-eyed glances. They had expected a disaster, a public humiliation. But what they were witnessing was something entirely different. Within moments, Alara put down the chalk and stepped back, her expression calm, her posture relaxed. "I believe that's the answer," she said simply. A tense silence gripped the room. Mrs. Calloway's lips pressed into a thin line as she stepped forward, eyes scanning the board. Her fingers twitched slightly as she double-checked each step, her mind racing to find an error, an oversight, anything that would justify her initial assumption. But there was nothing. The answer was correct. And not just correct. The method was elegant, far beyond what she had expected from any student, let alone a newcomer. A hushed murmur broke through the silence. Someone stifled a gasp. A boy in the back muttered, "No way," under his breath. Mrs. Calloway turned to face Ilara, but the fire in her eyes was no longer that of a victorious teacher. It was something else, something guarded. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked, her voice sharp. Ilara simply shrugged. "I like math." There was no arrogance in her tone, no smugness, just a quiet certainty that unsettled everyone even more than if she had gloated. Mrs. Calloway felt something coil in her chest. She had always been the one in control of her classroom, the one who set the rules. And yet, here stood a student who had not only met her challenge, but shattered her expectations without so much as breaking a sweat. The bell rang, breaking the tension. Chairs scraped as students gathered their belongings, stealing glances at Ilara as they filed out of the room. A few whispered to one another, their voices tinged with something between admiration and disbelief. Ilara turned to leave as well, but just as she reached the door, Mrs. Calloway's voice cut through the air. "Miss Quinn." Ilara stopped but didn't turn around. "We're not finished here." The students who had lingered near the doorway stiffened, their curiosity piqued. Ilara tilted her head slightly, a small smile ghosting across her lips. "As you wish, Mrs. Calloway." And with that, she walked out, leaving the teacher standing in the middle of the room, her carefully constructed authority now shaken by a girl who was far more than she seemed. By the time Ilara walked into the hallway, the news had already spread. Students clustered in small groups, murmuring, their heads turning as she passed. A few of them openly stared, others averted their eyes, as if unsure whether to be impressed or uneasy. It wasn't every day that someone strolled into Willow Creek High and shattered the pecking order within a single class period. Ilara, however, didn't seem fazed. She moved with the same quiet grace, her expression unreadable. "Hey!" She barely had time to react before someone fell into step beside her. A boy with messy brown hair, an easy smirk, and an oversized hoodie pulled up over his head. He carried himself with the kind of confidence that suggested he had nothing to prove, but there was something sharp in his eyes, something calculating. "Quite the show back there," he continued. "Calloway hasn't looked that stunned since she caught Jake Stevenson using ChatGPT on his calculus homework." Ilara glanced sideways at him. "And you are?" "Cameron Hayes," he said, stuffing his hands into his pockets. "But everyone just calls me Cam." She arched an eyebrow. "And why are you talking to me, Cam?" He grinned. "Because I have a feeling you're either the best thing to happen to this school or the worst." Ilara didn't respond right away. The two of them continued walking, passing rows of lockers and more lingering stares. "You don't seem like the type to care about math," she finally said. Cam chuckled. "You're not wrong, but I do care about power." Ilara stopped walking, turning to face him. And you just took a big chunk of it away from Mrs. Calloway," he said. "People like her. They don't like being made to look stupid." Ilara studied him, as if weighing his words carefully. There was an unsettling honesty in his tone, a warning wrapped in casual amusement. "So," he went on, tilting his head, "I gotta ask, was that some lucky guess? Or are you really that smart?" Ilara's lips twitched slightly, as if amused. "You tell me." Before Cam could respond, another voice cut through the air. "She's a freak, that's what she is." Both of them turned. Standing a few feet away was Mia Donovan, head of the cheerleading squad, undisputed queen of the school's social scene. Her arms were crossed, and her perfectly manicured nails tapped against her sleeve. A few of her friends stood behind her, smirking in quiet agreement. Ilara didn't flinch. Mia took a step closer, her smile laced with something cruel. "Look, new girl, I don't know what your deal is, but let me give you some advice. Nobody likes a know-it-all, especially one who makes teachers look stupid on their first day." Cam let out a low whistle. "Oof, that sounded like a threat." Mia shot him a withering glare before turning back to Ilara. "I'm just saying, this school has a way of putting people in their place." Ilara finally smiled, just a small, barely there curve of her lips. "That's cute." Mia blinked, caught off guard. Ilara stepped past her, pausing just long enough to say, "If I were you, I'd find something better to do than worry about me." With that, she walked away. Cam watched her go, shaking his head in amusement. "Oh man," he muttered, "she's definitely going to be the best thing or the worst thing to happen to this school." Mia, however, wasn't amused. Her jaw clenched, and in her eyes something dark flickered. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine lessons and whispered rumors. By lunchtime, the entire school had heard about what had happened in Mrs. Calloway's class. Some were impressed, others skeptical, and a few, like Mia Donovan, were outright hostile. Alara, however, remained unfazed. She navigated the crowded cafeteria with ease, sliding into a seat at an empty table near the back. She preferred solitude; it allowed her to observe. And right now, Willow Creek High was proving to be far more interesting than she had expected. Across the room, Mia sat at the center of a table surrounded by her usual followers. Every now and then, she'd throw a glance in Alara's direction, her lips curling slightly in distaste. Predictable, Alara thought. What she hadn't expected, however, was Cam. He strolled over, tray in hand, and plopped down across from her as if they'd been friends for years. "Hope you don't mind," he said. "Figured you could use some company." Alara gave him a look. "And why is that?" Cam grinned. "Because I like to bet on the underdog. And right now, that's you." Alara took a sip of her water, unimpressed. "I'm not an underdog." "Maybe not," Cam admitted, "but you are a wild card." Alara tilted her head slightly. "And that bothers you?" Cam chuckled. "Not at all, but it's got a lot of people nervous. You walked in here, cracked some impossible equation, and made Calloway look like an idiot. You shook the system, Alara, and in a place like this, that makes you either a queen or a target." Alara studied him for a moment. His words weren't just casual observations. There was a sharpness behind them, a knowing. He understood the way power worked in places like this, the way certain people controlled the narrative. She leaned back. "And which one do you think I am?" Cam smirked. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Before Alara could respond, a shadow fell over the table. She looked up to see Mrs. Calloway. The teacher's expression was unreadable, but her sharp eyes lingered on Alara with something between suspicion and intrigue. "Miss Quinn," she said coolly, "Principal Howard would like to see you in his office." A hush fell over the nearby tables. A few students leaned in to eavesdrop, their curiosity piqued. Alara, however, remained unbothered. She set down her water bottle, grabbed her tray, and rose from her seat. Of course. As she followed Mrs. Calloway out of the cafeteria, she could feel dozens of eyes on her, watching, wondering, and just before she disappeared through the doors, she caught Mia's expression across the room. Smug, satisfied. Alara didn't know what was waiting for her in the principal's office, but one thing was clear. Whatever game she had unwittingly stepped into, it had already begun. Alara walked down the quiet hallway, her footsteps barely making a sound against the polished tiles. Mrs. Calloway led the way, her shoulders stiff, her silence thick with unspoken thoughts. Alara, however, was calm, unbothered. She had been in situations like this before, where authority figures mistook intelligence for defiance, where systems rejected anything that disrupted their carefully maintained balance. When they reached Principal Howard's office, Mrs. Calloway knocked once before pushing the door open. "Miss Quinn is here," she announced, stepping aside. Principal Howard sat behind his large mahogany desk, his hands folded neatly over a thick folder, presumably her student records. He was a tall man, his gray hair combed back, his suit crisp and formal. His expression was unreadable. "Come in, Miss Quinn." Alara stepped inside, noting the single chair placed before the desk, an intentional power move. She took her seat, her posture poised, her expression neutral. Mrs. Calloway remained by the door, arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line. Howard exhaled, flipping open the folder. "You've had quite an eventful first day." Alara didn't respond. She simply waited. He tapped a document inside the folder. "I've looked over your academic records. Your transcripts are impressive, almost too impressive. Advanced calculus at 13, independent research in theoretical physics, a near-perfect SAT score." He shut the folder and leaned forward. "I have to ask, Miss Quinn, why are you here? A small-town high school like Willow Creek doesn't exactly seem like the kind of place a student of your caliber would choose." Alara met his gaze, unflinching. "Family reasons." Howard studied her, as if trying to see past the vague response. When she didn't elaborate, he sighed and leaned back. "Well, regardless of why you're here, I have concerns," he continued. I respect intellectual curiosity, but humiliating teachers in front of their students is not acceptable. Alara blinked, then tilted her head slightly. Was that what I did? Mrs. Calloway's nostrils flared. Don't play coy. You deliberately. I solved the equation you asked me to, Alara interrupted smoothly. If that made you look bad, that wasn't my intention. Calloway bristled. You knew exactly what you were doing. Alara remained silent. She knew arguing wouldn't change anything. In their eyes, intelligence wasn't an asset. It was a challenge, and challenges needed to be put in their place. Howard exhaled, rubbing his temple. Look, Miss Quinn, I don't want trouble, but I also don't want disruption. You've already drawn attention to yourself, and not in a way that benefits you. Alara could hear the unspoken warning. Stay in line. Don't stand out. Don't make enemies. She let a small, knowing smile tug at her lips. Understood. Howard narrowed his eyes slightly, as if sensing that her words weren't quite the submission he wanted. But he let it go. You're free to go, he said finally. But Miss Quinn, next time, I suggest you consider your actions more carefully. Alara stood gracefully. Duly noted. She turned to leave, but just as she reached the door, Calloway spoke again. You may have impressed some students today, Miss Quinn, she said, her tone quiet but sharp. But intelligence alone doesn't make you untouchable. Alara paused, her fingers on the doorknob. Then, without turning, she simply said, Neither does authority. And with that, she walked out. As she stepped into the empty hallway, her mind was already working, analyzing, strategizing. This school wanted her to shrink, to blend in. But that wasn't going to happen, because Alara Quinn didn't lose games. She played them better than anyone else. Alara walked out of the principal's office with measured steps, her mind calculating every possible outcome of what had just transpired. Principal Howard had issued a warning, and Mrs. Calloway had made her hostility clear. But what interested her most was the deeper game at play, one she hadn't fully uncovered yet. She made her way back toward class, but before she reached the main hallway, she heard hurried footsteps behind her. Hey! She turned to find Cam, slightly out of breath, his hands shoved into the pockets of his hoodie. What happened in there? He asked, his voice laced with curiosity. Alara raised an eyebrow. Concerned? More like intrigued, he admitted. Calloway looked pissed when she came out. You rattled her. Alara allowed herself a small smirk. I tend to have that effect. Cam chuckled. You know, you might be new here, but you're playing this game like you've been here for years. Alara tilted her head slightly. And what game is that? Cam leaned against the wall, watching her carefully. The one where people like Calloway and Mia Donovan don't like being outshined. At the mention of Mia's name, Alara's expression didn't change, but internally, she filed the information away. So, Mia wasn't just a random mean girl. She had power here. Interesting. Cam glanced around, making sure they were alone. Then, in a lower voice, he said, You should know. Mia's not just popular. Her dad's on the school board. She owns this place. Alara pretended to consider this. So? Cam let out a short laugh. So, people who cross her don't usually last long at Willow Creek. Alara met his gaze, her eyes steady. Then it's a good thing I don't plan on being most people. Cam studied her for a moment, then grinned. I had a feeling you'd say that. Just then, the lunch bell rang, signaling the end of the break. Students started spilling into the hallways, chatter and footsteps filling the space. Cam straightened. Watch your back, Quinn. The real game's about to start. Alara didn't respond. She simply turned and walked toward her next class, her mind already working ahead. She had never been one to play by their rules. If Mia Donovan and Mrs. Calloway thought they could push her into the shadows, they were sorely mistaken. Because Alara didn't just play games, she rewrote them. Part 7. Checkmate begins. Alara walked into the cafeteria, her eyes scanning the room like a strategist surveying a battlefield. The social hierarchy was immediately clear. Athletes and popular kids occupied the prime tables in the center, while the artists and academic overachievers clung to the edges. Mia Donovan, the so-called queen of the school, sat at the most prominent table, her meticulously styled hair catching the fluorescent light. Mia wasn't looking at her. Yet, Alara grabbed a tray and moved through the lunch line, aware of the quiet whispers that followed her. Word of her showdown with Mrs. Calloway had spread faster than wildfire, and now she was an unknown variable, one that people weren't sure whether to admire or avoid. She carried her tray to a less crowded table near the back, next to a window overlooking the football field. She had barely taken her first bite when a shadow fell over her. Mia. Alara took her time looking up, deliberately slow, as if unimpressed. Mia stood before her, flanked by two other girls, Lena and Taylor, whose entire presence screamed backup dancers to the queen bee. "I heard you made quite the entrance today," Mia said, her voice smooth, confident. Solving that equation, putting Calloway in her place. Alara wiped her mouth with a napkin before answering. "Wasn't my intention," she said. "I just answered the question." Mia's smile was razor sharp. "Right." She tilted her head. "You're new, so I'll give you some advice. Know your place." Alara arched a brow. "And where exactly is that?" Mia's gaze flickered with amusement. "Definitely not in my spotlight." Alara let a small smirk tug at her lips. "Good thing I don't need your spotlight. I make my own." A small murmur rippled through the surrounding tables. Mia's smile didn't falter, but the slight tightening of her jaw betrayed her irritation. "Careful, Quinn," Mia said in a softer tone. "I'm being nice right now." Alara set down her fork, "And I'm being patient." For the first time, Mia hesitated, just for a second. Then she gave a small, almost approving laugh. "Cute. Let's see how long that attitude lasts." With a flick of her hair, she turned and walked away, her entourage following close behind. As soon as they were out of earshot, Cam dropped into the seat across from Alara, grinning. "You really have a death wish, huh?" Alara picked up her fork again. "I don't believe in playing by someone else's rules." Cam chuckled. "Well, you just made an enemy out of the most powerful girl in school." Alara took a bite of her food, chewing thoughtfully. Then she met Cam's gaze and said, "No, Cam, she just made an enemy out of me." Because this wasn't just a battle for social dominance. This was a game of strategy. And Alara Quinn, she never lost. And just like that, the game has begun. Alara Quinn wasn't just another student, she was a force no one saw coming. But with powerful enemies watching her every move, the real question is, can she outsmart them all? What do you think happens next? Will Alara take down her rivals, or will the school's queen bee strike first? Comment below with your predictions. Like this video if you love stories about underdogs turning the tables. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss the next chapter. The best is yet to come.